Shh, we're writing the Constitution by Newbery honor-winning author Jean Fritz. Pictures by Tommy DePola. Cover illustrations by David Small. Shh. After the Revolutionary War, most people in America were glad they were no longer British. Still, they were not ready to call themselves Americans. The last thing they wanted was to become a nation. They were citizens of their own separate states, just as they had always been. Each state different, each state proud of its own character, each state quick to poke fun at other states. To Southerners, New Englanders might be no-account Yankees, and to New Englanders, Pennsylvanians might be lousy buckskins. But to everyone, the states themselves were all important. Sovereign states, they called them. They loved the sound of sovereign because it meant that they were their own bosses. George Washington, however, scoffed at the idea of sovereign states. He knew that the states could not be truly independent for long and survive. Ever since the Declaration of Independence had been signed, people had referred to the country as the United States of America. It was about time, he thought, for them to act and feel united. Once during the war, Washington had decided it would be a good idea if his troops swore allegiance to the United States. As a start, he lined up some troops from New Jersey, and he asked them to take such an oath. They looked at Washington as if he had taken leave of his senses. How could they do that, they cried. New Jersey was their country. So, Washington dropped the idea. In time, he hoped that the states would see that they needed to become one nation, united under a strong central government. But that time would be a long in coming. For now, as they started out on their independence, the 13 states were satisfied to be what they called a federation, a kind of voluntary league of states. In other words, each state legislature sent delegates to a continental congress, which was supposed to act on matters of common concern. In September 1774, when the First Continental Congress met, the common concern was Great Britain. 2 years later, after the Declaration had been signed, the concern was that the country needed some kind of government. Not a fully developed government, because of course they had their states. All they wanted were some basic rules to hold them together, to do whatever needed to be done. So, the Congress wrote the Articles of Confederation, which outlined rules for a firm league of friendship. In practice, however, the states did not always feel a firm need to follow any rules. The Congress, for instance, could ask the states to contribute money to pay to the country's debts. But if the states didn't feel like contributing, no one could make them. Congress could declare war, but it couldn't fight unless the states felt like supplying soldiers. The trouble was that their president had no definite powers, and the country had no overall legal system. So, although the Congress could make all the rules it wanted, it couldn't enforce any of them. Much of the time, the states didn't even bother to send delegates to the meetings. By 1786, it was becoming obvious that changes were needed. People were in debt. A few states were printing paper money that was all but worthless. And in the midst of this disorder, some people could see that America would fall apart if it didn't have a sound central government with power to act for all the states. George Washington, of course, was one who had felt strongly about this for a long time. Alexander Hamilton was another. Born and brought up in the Caribbean islands, he had no patience with the idea of state loyalty. America was nothing but a monster with 13 heads, he said. James Madison from Virginia wanted a strong America too. He was a little man, described as being no bigger than half a piece of soap, but he had big ideas for his country. In 1786, these men, among others, suggested to the Congress that all the states send delegates to the Grand Convention in Philadelphia to improve the existing form of government. It sounded innocent. Just a matter of revising the old Articles of Confederation to make the government work better. No one would quarrel with that. But they did. Rhode Island refused to have anything to do with the convention. Patrick Henry, when asked to be a delegate from Virginia, said he smelt a rat and he wouldn't go. Willie Jones of North Carolina didn't say what he smelled, but he wouldn't go either. But in the end, the convention was scheduled to meet in the State House in Philadelphia on May 14, 1787. James, or Jimmy Madison, was so worked up about it that he arrived from Virginia 11 days early. George Washington left his home, Mount Vernon, on May 9 with a headache and an upset stomach, but he arrived in Philadelphia on the 9th of May 13th. The next morning, a few delegates from Pennsylvania and a few from Virginia came to the meeting, but there needed to be 7 states present to conduct business. Since there were only 2, the meeting was adjourned. It was May 25th before delegates from enough states showed up. They blamed their delays on the weather, muddy roads, personal business, lack of money. Delegates from New Hampshire couldn't scrape up enough money to come until late July. But even so, they beat John Francis Mercer of Maryland. He sauntered into the State House on August 6. The most colorful arrival was that of Benjamin Franklin, who at 81 was the oldest of the delegates. Because he experienced so much pain when he was bounced about in a carriage, Franklin came to the convention in a Chinese sedan chair carried by 4 prisoners from the Philadelphia jail. He lived in the city, so they didn't have far to carry him. In all, there would be 55 delegates. Although coming and going as they did, there were seldom more than 30 there at the same time. The first thing the delegates did was to elect George Washington president of the convention. They escorted him to his official chair on a raised platform. Then the other members of the convention took their seats at tables draped with green woolen cloth. James Madison sat in the front of the room as soon as the talking began. He began writing. Never absent for a single day, he kept a record of all that was said during the next 4 months, stopping only when he himself wanted to speak. They knew that there would be many arguments in this room, but they agreed that they did not want the whole country listening in and taking sides. They would keep the proceedings a secret. So before every meeting, the door was locked. Sentries were stationed in the hall, and even though it turned out to be a hot summer, the windows were kept closed. Why should they risk eavesdroppers? Members were not supposed to write gossipy letters home, nor to answer nosy questions, nor to discuss their business with outsiders. Benjamin Franklin was the one who had to be watched. He meant no harm, but he did love to talk, especially at parties. So if he seemed about to spill the beans, another delegate was ready to leap into the conversation and change the subject. For 55 men to keep a secret for 4 months was an accomplishment in itself. But they did. Of course, this did not prevent rumors from starting. Once it was rumored that the convention was planning to invite the second son of George III to become King of America. The delegates were furious. They might not be able to say what they were going to do, but they had no trouble saying what they were not going to do. And they were not inviting the second or third son of George III or of anyone else to be King of America. If the people of the country were afraid of what might happen in the convention, so were the delegates themselves. They didn't call the document they were working on a constitution. They referred to it as the plan, because they knew that the country was sensitive to the word national. They tried to stick to federal, a word they were used to and one which didn't reduce the power of the states. But after Edmund Randolph, governor of Virginia, had presented what came to be called the Virginia Plan, he spoke right out. In the Virginia Plan, Randolph explained, there would be 3 branches of government. The executive branch would have a head who would be responsible for running the government. The legislative branch would be made up of 2 houses, which would make laws. The House of Representatives would be elected directly by the people. The Senate, the smaller and supposedly more cool-headed body, would be elected by the House. Together, they would be called Congress. The 3rd branch would be the judiciary, headed by a Supreme Court, which would make sure that the laws were constitutional and were properly obeyed. Edmund Randolph was a tall, handsome, likable man, and nothing he said at first seemed alarming. Some of the states had constitutions that were similar to the one he described. Besides, the members knew that after Randolph's plan had been discussed, other members would have a chance to present their plans. But at the end of his speech, Randolph did arouse his audience. It should be clear, he said, that his resolutions were not merely for a federal government, but for a national government that would be supreme over the states. There was dead silence. Pierce Butler of South Carolina was one of the first to recover. He jumped down hard on the word national, but John Dickinson of Delaware said there was nothing wrong with the word. We are a nation, he declared. No! For Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, this kind of talk was scary. He was a thin, warring sort of man who was sometimes called Rumpletonian behind his back. National? He sputtered. How could they think national? They had been sent here to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to destroy them. As the meetings went on, all kinds of fears surfaced. The smaller states with fewer people were afraid of the larger states which had more people. In the past, the votes of all states, no matter what their population, had counted the same. But a national government would be more concerned with individual people than with the states themselves. So what would happen to the small states now? And what kind of government were they forming? Some people were afraid of a high-toned or aristocratic government run by a small, privileged, wealthy group, the way a monarchy was usually run. Others were just as afraid of the common people having too much power. They weren't capable of governing, it was said. Eventually, the convention did agree on a national legislature to consist of 2 houses, but before final acceptance, the word national was crossed out. Still, there were so many questions to decide. What about the person who was to be the executive or the head of the government? Should there be just one person? If so, would he seem like a king? Or why not 3 people, each representing a different part of the country? But what if they fought among themselves? What if they couldn't reach an agreement? Should the executive be paid a salary? Yes, said Madison. Don't count on patriotism. But who should pay the salary? The states or the government of the United States? How should the executive be chosen? By the people? By the states? By a branch of the United States legislature? By electors? By lot? They had to vote 60 times before they could settle this question. And how long should the executive serve? If he were thought to be guilty of misconduct, could they impeach him? Could they remove him from office? Alexander Hamilton was one of the few who wanted the president to serve a long term, perhaps even for life. He thought it would be embarrassing to watch a lot of ex-presidents wandering around like ghosts. But suppose you had a long-term president, Franklin pointed out, and suppose he turned out to be a bad president. Well, what then? Out of simple kindness, they ought to provide some way to get rid of him. Otherwise, Franklin chuckled, the only thing they could do would be to shoot him. In the end, it was decided that there should be a single executive who would be paid out of the treasury of the new government. He would be chosen by electors from each state, and he would serve for 4 years. And yes, if it was necessary, he could be impeached. But what if he should die while in office? or be impeached. Well, who would take his place? So there had to be a vice president, the one who came in second in the presidential election. And since the vice president should do more than just wait around to see if the president would make it through his term, he was given the job of presiding over the Senate. Mr. Randolph finished presenting his plan on May 29, and for the next 2 weeks, until June 13, the convention went over it. Some measures were voted on, some would be revised, and all would be discussed again and again. But there was also the chance that the whole plan would be scrapped for something else. After a day's recess on June 15, William Patterson of New Jersey stood up. Only 5'2", he wasn't as impressive as a figure as Mr. Randolph, but he was a cheerful, modest, likable man. Still, he didn't approve of a single idea of Mr. Randolph's. The government should be a federation of states as it is now, with each state having an equal vote, he said. It should consist of one legislative body with several executives at its head. According to Mr. Patterson, the Virginia plan was impractical, illegal, and expensive. How could so many members of Congress, he asked, find the money to travel from all over the country to attend meetings? When James Madison answered Mr. Patterson, it was as if he were fencing. Madison danced all around Mr. Peterson's arguments, thrusting at first one point, then another, until it seemed as if there were nothing left of William Patterson's plan. And there wasn't. When the delegates were asked to vote in favor of the two plans, Mr. Randolph's won. 7 states against 3. Maryland's delegation was divided. Randolph's plan still had to be thrashed out, but the idea of a federation was dead. With this vote, the delegates committed themselves to write a constitution for a new nation, whether all of them were willing to call it that or not. But so much work lay ahead. They would be at it all summer, the delegates said, and some sent for their families to join them. John Dickinson of Delaware spent much of his free time writing to his 4-year-old daughter Maria, whom he always addressed as Pa's Precious. Rufus King of Massachusetts and Luther Martin of Maryland went to the library and took out books, but never returned them. Sorry, they said, when asked about it. Their servants must have failed to deliver them. Sorry or not, however, they had to pay for the books. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut had the most interesting news to write home. He had shaken the hand of a woman who was 2,000 years old, he said. An Egyptian mummy was on display in Philadelphia, but Oliver wasn't content just to look. He wondered what the flesh was like. So he took out his knife and he tested it, like old smoked beef, he reported. Meanwhile, the people in Philadelphia did their best to keep the delegates happy. They entertained them, provided musicals, and so that they could work in peace and quiet, they covered the cobblestone street in front of the State House with gravel. Now carriages made less noise when they rode past. But there were some things Philadelphians could not change. The heat, for instance. It was a blistering summer, especially for the delegates from New England who, not used to such heat, sweated out the summer in woolen suits. And there were bluebottle flies. Philadelphia was bombarded by these huge buzzing flies. They flung themselves at the windows of the State House, attacked the delegates when they stepped outside, and invaded bedrooms, buzzing all night in such a frenzy they sounded insane. Nor could Philadelphia do anything about the prison, which stood in front of the State House yard. It was a 4-story building, and as soon as the delegates came into the yard, prisoners crowded against their windows and pushed long begging poles through the iron bars. Attached to the end of each pole was a cloth cap for collecting money. The prisoners would dangle the poles, wiggle them, and cry out to be noticed. And if the delegates were not generous enough, and how could they be generous enough every day? Well, the prisoners would jeer and call the delegates nasty names. It could not have been fun to sit all day in a stuffy room arguing and then be insulted as soon as they stepped out for a breath of fresh air. On the other hand, The delegates may have had too much on their minds to pay attention. Certainly they suffered in many ways, and it was a wonder they didn't quit. Some did. 2 delegates from New York, who didn't like the way the convention was going, went home. But most knew that they were deciding the future of their country, one which would be larger and different from anything they could imagine now. Sometimes when a delegate worried that the people wouldn't like this or the people wouldn't like that, James Madison became impatient. Who knew what the people would like, he asked. Their job was to make the best possible government, not simply please the people. And all the time George Washington sat in front of him, his expression stern as if he were saying, now or never. It would be hard to walk out on Washington. Yet it was sometimes hard to stay, especially when Luther Martin of Maryland took the floor. He was a tall, mussed-up-looking man who loved the sound of his own voice so much that once he started talking, he couldn't bear to stop. He talked loudly and passionately. He repeated himself, and indeed was so boring that Madison didn't even bother to write it all down, and Benjamin Franklin went to sleep. But as the convention droned on and on, the delegates worried. Was it possible for them ever to agree on a constitution? The biggest stumbling block was the question of how power should be divided in the government. Should the states be represented in Congress according to the population of each state? Yes, said the large states with large populations. No, said the small states with small populations. Madison tried to point out that the large states would have no reason to gang up on the smaller states. The large states had so little in common, they would probably end up, he said, as rivals, not friends. But the small states were not convinced. At one point, the tension was so great that Franklin suggested they ask the ministers to start them off every day with a prayer. But they couldn't even agree on this. A delegate from North Carolina pointed out that there wasn't enough money to pay a minister. Hamilton said that the appearance of a minister would start rumors. People would say that if the convention was suddenly in need of prayer, it must be in deep trouble. In particular, the small states wanted to know if they would have an equal vote in the Senate. The delegates could not reach a decision. When they took a vote, it came out a tie. 5 yes, 5 no, with Georgia's delegates divided. The small states became so bitter that once they threatened to break off from the rest of the country and make their own treaties with foreign nations. This was the lowest point of the whole summer. The convention was held together now, Luther Martin said, by no more than a strength of a hair. Washington, not easily discouraged, admitted that he almost despaired, and indeed his feelings must have shown on his face. He had his Valley Forge look, people said. Perhaps the weather helped to break the stalemate. The month-long heat wave broke over the weekend of July 14 and 15, and by Monday, July 16, the delegates seemed to recognize how urgent it was to find a way to agree. And they did. They called it the Great Compromise. Every state would have 2 members in the Senate with equal votes, while the House of Representatives would have 1 representative for every 40,000 inhabitants. Later this was changed to read, not to exceed 1 for every 30,000. It was such a relief to have this settled that the convention appointed a committee of 5 to put their resolutions in order and make a document that would read like a constitution. Then the delegates voted themselves a 10-day vacation from July 26 to August 6. George Washington went fishing and caught a massive perch near Trenton. It was a welcome diversion. Still, as always, he was homesick for Mount Vernon. He had written home earlier that he would not be back before harvest, and God knows how long it may be after. He wanted the honeysuckle against the house nailed up. "Have you thinned out the carrots?" he asked. 6 weeks of work still lay ahead after the convention reassembled. Throughout the discussions there had been trouble, not only between the large states and the small states, but between the northern states and the southern states. the southern states worried about their trade. Since the House of Representatives was dominated by northern states, where more people lived, would it be fair to the South? The House had the power to tax what was sold and sent out of the states and to tax what was brought into the states. So what would happen to the tobacco, the rice, and indigo grown in the South and sold abroad? What would happen to slaves brought into the South? Would the North try to get rid of slavery altogether? Some Northern delegates were quick to say that was exactly what they wanted, but some Southern delegates were just as quick to say that they would not belong to a government that dictated their private business. It was clear that if they wanted a constitution, the North and the South would have to strike a bargain. So, the Northern states agreed to continue the slave trade until 1808, and the Southern states agreed to give up their demand that commercial regulations had to be passed by a 2/3 vote of both houses. In addition, no one would have to pay more than $10 tax on a slave brought into the country. And there were other questions. Where would the government be located? New York? Philadelphia? A special district should be set aside, they said, not more than 10 miles square. But since they couldn't decide where it should be, they decided to let new Congress take care of it. How about letting foreigners be members of Congress? Governor Morris, called the tall boy of the convention, pointed out that if it took 7 years to learn how to be a shoemaker, a foreigner ought to spend 14 years to learn how to be an American legislator. In the end, a senator was required to be a citizen for 9 years, a representative 7 years, and the chief executive or president had to be native born. They made provisions for new states to join the Union and specified how additions or changes to the Constitution could be made in the future. These would be called amendments, but under no circumstances were they to change the type of government the delegates had created. The delegates did not want any American dukes or lord suddenly popping up in their society. No title of nobility, they said, shall be granted by the United States. Now, the end was actually in sight, but how should they present the Constitution to the states? Should each state legislature vote on whether it would accept or ratify the Constitution? No, they decided. The state legislators could not be trusted. They would want to keep their own power in their state, and they would vote no. It would be better if each state called its own special convention. Next came the question, how many states had to ratify the Constitution before it became the law of the land? Some delegates wanted all 13 states to ratify, but everyone knew Rhode Island would not do it, and New York was doubtful, so it was agreed that if 9 states ratified, they would have a nation. Any that did not ratify would simply not be in the Union. On September 8, the Constitution was sent to a committee to write it up in final form. 4 days later, a revised and very elegant-sounding Constitution was presented to the delegates. "We the people," it began. It was impressive, but it was also scary. Some of the delegates did not think of themselves as "we the people." It gave them a strange feeling to have created a nation that they didn't really know. All at once, some had last-minute thoughts. They had not included a Bill of Rights, which spelled out the rights of individual persons, it was pointed out. There was no mention of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, trial by jury, all those rights which they had cherished and which many states had listed in their constitutions. Madison sighed. There was no need for a Bill of Rights, he said. It was taken for granted that individuals kept all the rights that they didn't specifically give over to the government. Finally, with some changes, the Constitution was sent out to be engrossed on parchment, an official document for the delegates to sign. When it came back, the delegates looked at it in wonder. After all, this was the first time that a people had written down rules to start a nation off from scratch. On paper, the Constitution looked so real that Washington declared it was a little short of a miracle. Still, it was not perfect, Benjamin Franklin pointed out. He disagreed with some parts, but then he wasn't perfect either. None of them were, and he was convinced that it was the best that they could do. He hoped that the delegates would give their new constitution a chance. Let them not undo their summer's work, he begged, by carrying their old arguments into the public. Let them stand together. Some members, like Luther Martin, who would not have signed, had already gone home. But there were 42 delegates present on September 17, and 39 signed. At the last minute, 3 backed out. Elbridge Gerry was one of them. Without the Bill of Rights, he said, he could not put his name down. Edmund Randolph, whose Virginia plan had actually formed the basis of the Constitution, got cold feet. Perhaps he had been too hasty. Perhaps he was still too much of a Virginian to be an American, too. Perhaps he should wait to see how the country reacted before he made up his mind. George Mason, also of Virginia, refused to sign. Now it was up to the country. After so much secrecy, people did not know what to expect. But once they had read the Constitution, they were quick to take sides. Those who were for it called themselves Federalist. Those against it were called Anti-Federalist, although the antis, they said, were the true Federalist, and those in favor of the Constitution should be called Nationalist. It took more than 6 months for the states, one by one, to call their conventions, debate, and vote. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and another strong Federalist, John Jay, began writing newspaper articles explaining just how the new Constitution would work. They showed how the different branches of government would serve as a check on each other so that no one branch or no one person could become too powerful. Steeped in history, these men understood human nature and the temptations of power. They might not expect to make a government absolutely safe from all forms of tyranny, but their object was to create a kind of obstacle game which would keep the government in balance. Indeed, they talked so much of checks and balances that this might describe the kind of game it was. Every bill the House of Representatives passed, for instance, had to go to the Senate for its approval. If it made it through the Senate, then it had to go to the President for his signature. If he did not like the bill, he could veto or refuse to sign it. But the House and the Senate still had another chance. If 2/3 of their members voted for it, then it would pass anyway. A final big check lay in the Supreme Court, which could, in the course of legal proceedings, decide if a law, even a state law, was constitutional or not. There was a whole network of such checks. Although the president could appoint ambassadors to other countries, judges to the Supreme Court, and a variety of other officers, the Senate had to approve his choices. Any amendment proposed to the Constitution had to be submitted to the states for their approval. Now how, the Federalist asked, could tyranny slip through such a well-ordered system? Besides, the people themselves had the controlling power. Every 4 years, they would be electing their president, and at stated intervals, they would also be electing their representatives to Congress. The arguments of the Federalists were so strong and so well written that many people gradually grew used to the idea of becoming a nation. But not all. Patrick Henry took one look at the first words of the Constitution and saw red. "We the people," he snorted. Since when had they become a single people? He'd known something hadn't smelled right, and here was this fancy document that with a single stroke wiped out the 13 separate identities. Besides, it didn't say one word about those basic rights they had fought a war over. All over the country, people argued about the Bill of Rights. In Connecticut, Noah Webster, educator and compiler of dictionaries, contended that such a bill would be nonsense. How could you list all the rights a person had, he asked. Would you include the right to go fishing in good weather? The right for people to turn over in bed at night? But most people were serious about the issue, and many were unhappy. Federalists tried to reassure them. Once the government was formed, they pointed out, the Constitution could easily be amended to include those rights that they wanted. All they had to do was to recommend improvements and then go ahead and ratify. If they didn't, they'd end up with neither a government nor a Bill of Rights. Delaware started off the state conventions, and on December 7 was the first to ratify the Constitution. Its vote was unanimous, as was New Jersey's on December 18 and Georgia's on January 2, 1788. Other states had a harder time reaching an agreement. Pennsylvania ratified on December 12 with a vote of 46-23. Connecticut on January 9 with a vote of 128-40. Massachusetts argued for a month, and although it finally ratified on February 6, the vote was close, 187 to 168. Maryland came along on April 28, 63 to 11, and South Carolina on May 23, 149 to 73. On June 21st, New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, 57 to 47. And with this vote, the United States of America officially became a nation. But people were still anxious for the big states to join so that the new nation would seem more impressive. Virginia was an important state, but if Patrick Henry had his way, it would never have joined. He spoke against the Constitution for 2 weeks, once giving 8 speeches in one day, one speaking all day long. But on June 26, the Virginia Convention did ratify, 89 to 79. A month later, on July 26, New York, which had never been enthusiastic, also voted yes, 30 to 27. North Carolina, however, voted no, and Rhode Island didn't even bother to hold a convention. When they saw the results of the other elections, they accused the rest of the country of seceding from them. Eventually, they changed their minds. North Carolina joined the Union in November 1789, and Rhode Island in May 1790. But Philadelphia couldn't wait for all the states to come into the Union before celebrating. As soon as Virginia had ratified, Philadelphia got ready for a big 4th of July celebration. Indeed, the grand procession that marched through the city from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening was so grand, it was a wonder that there was enough people left over to watch. Leading the parade was a herald with a trumpet proclaiming the new age. Riders on horseback carried banners that celebrated everything and every person worth celebrating. A float made to look like a giant blue eagle rode up the cobblestone streets, followed by an enormous framed Constitution propped up in a carriage pulled by 6 white horses. A fancy building with 13 columns representing the new nation was pulled in a vehicle drawn by 10 white horses. Of course, there was music. High-stepping bands beating and blowing kept the town tapping to their tunes. And people, 450 architects and carpenters marched in the procession. There were saw makers and file cutters, farmers with their 4 ox plows, weavers, tailors, goldsmiths, gunsmiths, brickmakers, clockmakers, boat builders, coopers, bakers, corset makers, and preachers. The federal ship Union, mounted with 20 guns, brought up the rear of the procession, and everyone ended up at a picnic spread out for 17,000 people. The country may have kicked and screamed its way into becoming a nation, but once there, it celebrated. Bells pealed and cannons roared as state after state acknowledged that the Constitution they had adopted was now the supreme law of the land. 2 of America's most important statesmen, however, were not in the country during any of the constitutional proceedings. John Adams, who would be our 2nd president, was in England, serving as our ambassador. Thomas Jefferson, who would be our third president, was our ambassador to France. When John Adams, just arriving in Boston in 1788, heard the news that the Constitution had been adopted, he wrote to Jefferson. "As we say at sea," he wrote, "Huzza for the new world, and a farewell to the old one." And Thomas Jefferson, once he felt satisfied that a Bill of Rights would be included, called the new Constitution unquestionably the wisest ever yet presented to men.